Welcome back everyone to more NR 2003. And in today's video, it's all about setups. In fact, as we prepare for the new NASCAR season, which will be here before you know it, just in a couple of months, I thought we'd take these next few weeks and run the late model mod on some short tracks. Some that you may have heard of, some maybe you haven't heard of, but all very high quality tracks done by the wonderful community in NR 2003. But in order to do that, I'm going to need some setups to run on these tracks. And since the entire point of these is to not spend a whole lot of time practicing and dialing things in, I created a baseline setup for the mod where I can essentially go to a brand new track, load that default setup in, run a few laps, make a few changes, and then we're ready to race. So that's the point of today's video, is to show you guys my baseline setup and talk about why I'm doing some of the things I am within the setup itself. The overall purpose of a baseline setup is to give you a car that is comfortable to drive and a car that responds to your inputs in a very predictable manner. That way, when you're going to a new track, you can focus on learning the track, hitting your marks, as opposed to worrying about chasing the car around because you're never quite sure of how the car is going to react to your throttle inputs, braking inputs, or steering inputs. The setup I'm going to be showing you guys today was built for comfort. There are some things that I do with this setup that are maybe taking a little bit of speed away from the car, but greatly increase the feel and the fun overall that I can have with this car, because I need a car that's going to be maneuverable and predictable. So some of the things we're going to talk about are going to lead directly to that goal and maybe take a little bit away from the speed, particularly the qualifying short run type speed, in favor of more of a balanced car over the long run. So we're actually going to start out with the weight bias and work our way backwards, because the comfort and the maneuverability is really going to start here in this section. The front bias 53.0 that you see here, we're actually at, if you take a look at the top of the screen, we're at the Motordrome, which is a track I'd never heard of. So I downloaded it to test it out as a short track, and I've really enjoyed it. But one of the things I found is that I needed to run a little bit more front bias in order for the car to feel secure, particularly on corner entry. The car wanted to over-rotate, so I've definitely built in some rotation to the car, but I also needed to control that so that I wasn't worried about spinning out each and every lap. And here, 53.0, which is the highest that I have gone on any of the tracks that I've tried out so far. And again, that's just to give more stability. So more front bias is going to tighten the car up, but it's also going to give it some stability. And of course, stability is one of the things I'm looking for. And 53.0, again, the maximum that I've used so far. But in general, my front bias has been anywhere from a 51.0 up to a 53.0, just to give you an idea of the different tracks and how they work out and how some of the changes actually work that I'm making. Now, left side bias is always going to be maxed out to the far left because we're only on ovals and we're not dealing with any sort of road courses or street courses, anything like that, where we would need to balance out that left to right weight bias. The wedge maxed out at 52.1%. Now, that is one thing that I do not change at any track, and this is a feel thing for me. It is an issue of stability and feel. There are certain things about the NR 2003 tires that I don't really prefer, things that don't feel right to me, and using a lot of wedge is one thing I can do to sort of overcome that just a little bit. So this is one thing that I do not change from track to track. The higher wedge setting gives the car a little bit more of a secure feel, similar to the way I described the front bias, but the wedge is all about controlling the rotation of the car. So higher wedge controls the rotation a little bit better, whereas lower wedge allows the car to rotate a little bit quicker, which some people definitely prefer, but for me, I would prefer to control that a little bit more than worrying about quicker rotation in the car. Now, the grill tape, not really that important to the car, but somewhere around 50-55% is generally what I have been using. Sometimes I'll try to push that right to the limit of overheating, but for these short tracks, for the most part, I'll just find a setting and go with it. Spoiler, I have not touched. I've left that at 70 degrees, although I definitely know that there are ways that you can take advantage of that because the higher the spoiler, the tighter the car is going to be, because this is adding more rear downforce. So it's going to make the rear of the car more secure, give you more grip back there. But lowering this number can free the car up, as well as taking drag out of the car. So you can, on some of the bigger tracks, pick up some straightaway speed by adjusting this. Now the final drive, the transmission overall, is something that's going to differ from track to track. But in general, I like to just leave this alone for the first 3 gears. And then 4th gear, I love to run a 1.0. It's just something I have gotten used to. It used to be a rule in the Cup Series. I'm not sure if it even is anymore, but I've gotten so used to this that I simply will spend all of my time adjusting the differential as opposed to messing around with the individual gears. But again, this is something you're going to have to adjust from track to track based on the size of the track and the speeds. Now let's move our way to the suspension. So again, keep in mind, this is a baseline, not something that has been honed in 100% for a particular track. We'll start out with the tire pressures, 22 on the left, 34 on the right. Now, tire pressures, I generally don't mess around a whole lot with the left side. I might adjust maybe a half of a PSI, maybe a full PSI from time to time. But for the most part, any adjustment I do to the tire pressure is likely to be on the right side. So for the right front, if I increase the right front pressure, that's because I'm a little bit loose on entry and I want to tighten it up just a little bit without getting into the springs, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. So increasing the right front pressure will help tighten the car up a little bit on entry. Moving down to the right rear, increasing this will actually make the car looser on corner exit, but in general, what I'm likely to be doing with this is actually lowering this to maybe 33.5, maybe 33.0 in order to tighten up and give some security when I get back to the throttle on corner exit. So not a lot of adjustments to tire pressures. Essentially what I'll do with these is I'll go out and I will run some laps, and then I'll come in and I'll take a look at the temperatures, the inside, middle, and outside, just to make sure that I am somewhere around proper inflation, meaning that the middle is in between the inside and outside. And as long as that is roughly where it needs to be, then I'm probably going to make only minor adjustments, if any adjustments at all, to the tire pressure. So again, not something that I mess around with a lot unless I go to a particular track where I find that I'm either underinflated or overinflated on a particular tire. The shocks, also something that, because all of these tracks we're dealing with are short tracks, I really haven't messed with. I've come up with a package that has worked pretty well for me in giving me the feel that I want, so I've just stuck with it. So again, not something that I'm likely to mess around with a lot. If I am really loose or really tight on the entry of the corner, then I might come in and make a few adjustments to the rebound in the rear, compression in the front, but for the most part, I have left these alone. Then we get to the springs. Now this is a big one, because overall, my preference on springs is to get the softest front springs that I can have. Now that's going to be particularly more important and a little bit harder to do on the bigger tracks, say Michigan or Charlotte, something like that, where you're dealing with the car bottoming out or dragging a lot more. Here, I can generally just go to the softest front springs because I am also using the max front ride height at 5.5 and 6.0. So from that perspective, it is a lot simpler on short tracks because I can get by with the very soft springs in the front, but you'll notice that I'm a little bit higher on the right front, and that is to give me just a little bit something extra to lean on corner entry. One of the things that I battle quite a bit in NR 2003 is being loose on entry. So I make sure to dial in a lot of rotation from the car, and a lot of times that can make you loose on entry. So one of the things I do to combat that, along with some weight bias and wedge adjustments that we've talked about, is to increase that right front spring just a little bit. And that will give me something to lean on corner entry. If I'm still too loose on corner entry, then I might go up a couple more clicks here, but generally this has been a very good compromise for me. So again, loose on entry, and you can increase this right front spring and really help out with that. Then we move on to the camber. So 4.5 on the left front, 1.5 on the right front. Those have been very good numbers. Certainly not perfect for all the tracks, but again, just giving me a good baseline to go on. If you need a little bit more turn out of the front of the car, then the quickest way to do that is to increase that right front camber. But for these purposes, I've decided not to go too crazy with it. The max I would probably ever use is something like -3.0, maybe a touch higher than that. But for the most part, the -1.5 is just about perfect for what I need out of this car. Next, we come to the caster, which is another area where I really like to dial in the feel and try to counteract some of the issues that I have with the tires and the overall feel of those, and that is to increase the caster. Now, more caster is going to give you a heavier feel to the steering, particularly if you're using a force feedback wheel. And in this case, I'm using 5.0 and 6.0 on the left front and the right front respectively. Now, as well as the total amount of caster you're using, the higher number being more caster, you also want to pay attention to the difference in caster from left to right. If I increase this difference, in this case meaning that I decrease the left front caster down to 4 or 3 and so on, the bigger the difference between the left front and the right front, you can introduce some looseness out of the car as you start to turn the wheel more on the entry of the corner. That's something I do not want. So a 1 degree difference here is about the max I will ever use. And at some tracks, I will actually go down to about a 1/2 degree of difference in the caster. So that is something that I use quite a bit to maneuver the car and adjust the feel to the car. So again, for me, the max of about 1.0, and sometimes I will go down to even a 1/2 of difference there in the caster, and that works very well for me. The ride height, we touched on a little bit earlier. This is something I don't mess with. 5.5 here on the left front, and then you see what that does in the rear as well. That's something I haven't messed with. Not that you can't, but for me, this gives me exactly what I'm looking for, so I simply leave it as is. Moving on to the front brake bias. Now, this is something that is vital on the short tracks. You want to make sure that you get this number high enough that you're not introducing a really loose on entry situation to the car, but you also don't want to go too high, because the more front brake bias you put in the car, the tighter the car will be under braking, particularly heavy braking. And then as you move that brake bias back or decrease this number, then you will free the car up or loosen the car up under heavy braking. So you can actually use this as a tool to help the car get into the corner if you need a little bit of rotation when under heavy braking. But for me, I prefer to move this a little bit higher to about 70, anywhere from 73 to about 76, maybe 77%, depending on the track. So 75% is a nice middle ground for me. Front toe out, I never mess with. I leave it somewhere around this number, maybe down a click or two, if anything, but 0.125 is essentially perfect for me. It gives me what I need. So this is not something that I generally mess around with. The front toe out is what you will want on the front of the car, and toe in is not something that you will want on the front of the car. So you would not want to get down into the negative numbers here. That's one thing that I have never had any good luck with when I've tried it. So stick with toe out at the front. Just a few clicks should be fine. Moving on now to the front and rear sway bar. The rear sway bar is something I will rarely ever use, and this has been the case in multiple games. Those of you who have been with me through the NASCAR Heat Series will remember that it was pretty rare that I would ever use the rear sway bar, and that is a feel thing for me. I don't really like the feeling of a rear sway bar, although it can certainly help with the rotation of the car. But for me, it's something I generally stay away with for the reason of it just doesn't quite feel right for me. But the front sway bar, I am generally anywhere between this 1.75 inches on the high side down to around 1.5 inches on the low side. A bigger front sway bar means a tighter car overall, less roll out of the car, particularly on corner entry. But the lower number will allow the car to roll more and can really help to free the car up and increase the amount of rotation overall that you're getting from the car. For me, I prefer a little bit stiffer car, so I'm going to go with a little bit higher number here. And again, 1.5 to 1.75 is generally what I prefer. Moving on to the rear of the car, again, the shocks, not something that I'm going to be messing around with a whole lot. I prefer a little bit softer shock in the rear, but if I'm going to adjust anything at all, it's probably going to be for corner entry, which means that I'll be hitting the rebound on the rear shock and the compression on the front shocks. Moving on now to the springs. Now the springs are something, particularly the rear springs, are something that I can use quite a bit and completely change the feeling of a car by doing nothing more than adjusting the rear springs. So I really like that. And this is particularly important for me because I prefer to drive the car using the throttle, meaning that the more I lift off the throttle, the more the car rotates. The more I'm on the throttle, the more the car rotates. So I can really modulate the car using and really rotate the car using the gas pedal. And that is the way I prefer to drive the car. So the rear springs are particularly important for me. And so now let's talk about a couple of ways in which that's the case. Number one is the overall stiffness of the rear spring. So the softer the rear springs, the less the car will rotate. So you're going to tighten the car up by making these rear springs softer overall. And the inverse is also true. The more you increase the rear springs, the more the car is going to want to rotate. The more the rear of the car is going to steer the car. And this is something that I love to use. In fact, on some of the truck physics, something we've been using in, of course, with the Cup mod here recently, I like to use pretty stiff rear springs because it really allows me to rotate the car using the throttle. But here I'm using a little bit softer package here on the short tracks because softer rear springs give me a lot more bite off the corner, meaning that I can be more aggressive with the throttle and the rear end will squat down and actually get a lot of grip up off the corner, and that really can get you a lot of straightaway speed. So again, it's something you have to really balance out. Softer springs are going to give you better grip when you get back to the throttle. Stiffer springs are going to give you better rotation through the corner. So balance that out. But for me, the second thing that is very important beyond the actual stiffness or softness of the springs is the relationship between the left rear and the right rear. Here you see I've got 50 pounds of split, so not a whole lot of rear split in the springs. This is going to directly affect how the car feels when you get back to the throttle in the middle of the corner. The more split that you have, the looser the car will be. The more it will want to rotate when you get back to the throttle. The less difference you have in the springs between left rear and right rear, the tighter the car will be. So if you're using either no split at all or very little split in the rear springs, the car will want to go straight when you get back to the gas. So again, it's all about how you drive the car. If you like to get back to the gas early, so you need the car to really rotate, then you're going to want more split in the rear springs and probably more rear spring overall as far as the stiffness goes. But for me, I'm really pushing to allow that car to rotate before I get back to the gas, so I'm using a little bit less rear spring split. And that will change from track to track, but somewhere around 100, maybe 150 at the most as far as the split here in the rear springs. Now camber, very easy in the rear of the car, plus 1.8, minus 1.8, very simple there, not something that I will likely ever touch. And then we get to probably the second most important thing for me when I'm adjusting, most important being the rear springs, and that is the track bar. So the track bar is going to help the car rotate overall. And this is something that you can really use to change the feel of the car. Again, just as I was talking about with the rear springs. So with the track bar, you can really help the rear of the car rotate a lot better by running a higher track bar. So increasing this number from 10 to 11, 12, and so on. Same thing on the left rear from 9 to 9.5, 10, and so on. But just as with the rear springs, not only do we deal with the height of the track bar, which a higher track bar will make the car freer. It will want the car to rotate more, making the car looser. A lower number will tighten the car up quite a bit. But then also we have to deal with the relationship between the left and the right side. So when you get the track bar higher on the right side than the left side, that's really going to loosen the car up on corner exit. This is going to sound a whole lot like what we were talking about with the rear springs, and it should. So with the track bar, I've got about a 1-inch difference here. The most I will run is about 3 inches, but that's more of an extreme case for me. Normally I'm going to be 1.5 inches of difference because, again, for me, I'm looking for a feel, I'm looking for security, not necessarily to be on that ragged edge and get the max speed. So the closer you have the left side and the right side, the more stability you're going to have out of the car, particularly as you're on and off the gas and the brakes and so on as you're going through the corner. Also, something that I have had great success with in the past that I like to do from time to time is actually run a higher left side than right side. What this can do for you is really help out with the entry. If you're just really tight on the entry, but the car overall feels really good, but the entry just isn't quite right, it's just too tight, then increase this left side, and that will help with the entry of the corner. And once you get the left side higher than the right side, it can really help to tighten up the exit. So it can help you get into the corner really nicely without overly loosening up the exit of the corner. So again, I've used that quite a bit in the past. This particular setup isn't built around that, but it is certainly something worth trying out. So hopefully that'll give you guys an idea of what I'm using as we go through the next few weeks on these short tracks. And hey, maybe you can even find a way to incorporate these into your own gameplay. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and stick around for more in our 2003.